Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. This is a podcast where I read old books, sometimes fiction, sometimes non-fiction, in the most boring way I can, to try and help slow your spinning mind enough for you to fall asleep in the most natural way possible. The stresses of life often follow us to bed and keep us company, but I'm here to distract you from them and help you drift away. If you do fall asleep, if you find Sleepy Time Tales helpful and you'd like to support me to keep it going out to you and thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. You can contribute at $2 or $5 a month there, and you get bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and see if you're interested. If monthly is a bit much, you can also put a tip in the tip jar. Both of these are linked in the show notes as well. Or you can support Sleepy Time Tales by simply telling people about it. If you know someone who's struggling to sleep and you think that listening to me will help them, tell them about it. And now we're about to start learning about the great tulipomania of the 17th century. So snuggle down, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and listen closely as I lead you down the path to sleep. We return this week to Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions, Volume 1 by Charles Mackay. The Tulipomania. The tulip, so named it is said, from a Turkish word signifying a turban, was introduced into Western Europe about the middle of the 16th century. Conrad Gessner, who claims the merit of having brought it into repute, little dreaming of the extraordinary commotion it was to make in the world, says that he first saw it in the year 1559 in a garden at Augsburg, belonging to the learned councillor Herwart, a man very famous in his day for his collection of rare exotics. The bulbs were sent to this gentleman by a friend at Constantinople, where the flower had long been a favourite. In the course of 10 or 11 years after this period, tulips were much sought after by the wealthy, especially in Holland and Germany. Rich people at Amsterdam sent for the bulbs direct to Constantinople and paid the most extravagant prices for them. The first roots planted in England were brought from Vienna in 1600. Until the year 1634, the tulip annually increased in reputation, until it was deemed a proof of bad taste in any man of fortune to be without a collection of them. Many learned men, including Pompeius de Angelis and the celebrated Lipsius of Leyden, the author of the treatise De Constantia, were passionately fond of tulips. The rage for possessing them soon caught the middle classes of society, and merchants and shopkeepers, even of moderate means, began to vie with each other in the rarity of these flowers and the preposterous prices they paid for them. A trader at Haarlem was known to pay 1/2 of his fortune for a single root, not with the design of selling it again at a profit, but to keep in his own conservatory for the admiration of his acquaintance. One would suppose there must have been some great virtue in this flower to have made it so valuable in the eyes of so prudent a people as the Dutch. But it has neither the beauty nor the perfume of the rose, hardly the beauty of the sweet, sweet pea, neither is it as enduring as either. Cowley, it is true, is loud in its praise. He says, "The tulip next appeared, all over gay, but wanton full of pride and full of play. The world can't show her dye, but here has place, nay, by new mixtures she can change her face. Purple and gold are both beneath her care, the richest needlework she loves to wear. Her only study is to please the eye and to outshine the rest in finer eye." This, though not very poetical, is the description of a poet. Beckmann, in his History of Inventions, paints it with more fidelity, and in prose more pleasing than Cowley's poetry. He says, "There are few plants which acquire, through accident, weakness or disease, so many variegations as the tulip. When uncultivated and in its natural state, it is almost of one color, has large leaves and an extraordinarily long stem. When it has been weakened by cultivation, it becomes more agreeable in the eyes of the florist. The petals are then paler, smaller, and more diversified in hue, and the leaves acquire a softer green color. Thus, this masterpiece of culture, the more beautiful it turns, grows so much the weaker, so that, with the greatest skill and most careful attention, it can scarcely be transplanted or even kept alive. Many persons grow insensibly attached to that which gives them a great deal of trouble, as a mother often loves her sick and ever-ailing child better than her more healthy offspring. Upon the same principle, we must account for the unmerited encomia lavished upon these fragile blossoms. In 1634, the rage among the Dutch to possess them was so great that the ordinary industry of the country was neglected, and the population, even to its lowest dregs, embarked in the tulip trade. As the mania increased, prices augmented, until in the year 1635, many persons were known to invest a fortune of 100,000 florins in the purchase of 40 roots. It then became necessary to sell them by their weight in perits, a small weight less than a grain. A tulip of the species called Admiral Leafkin, weighing 400 perits, was worth 4,400 florins. An Admiral von der Eyck, weighing 446 perits, was worth 1,260 florins. A Schilder of 106 perits was worth 1,615 florins. A Viceroy of 400 perits, 3,000 florins. And most precious of all, a Semper Augustus weighing 200 perits was thought to be very cheap at 5,500 florins. The latter was much sought after, and even an inferior bulb might command a price of 2,000 florins. It is related that, at one time, early in 1636, there were only 2 roots of this description to be had in all Holland, and those not of the best. One was in the possession of a dealer in Amsterdam and the other in Haarlem. So anxious were the speculators to obtain them, that one person offered the fee simple of 12 acres of building ground for the Haarlem tulip. That of Amsterdam was bought for 4,600 florins, a new carriage, 2 grey horses, and a complete suit of harness. Munting, an industrious author of that day who wrote a folio volume of 1,000 pages upon the tulipomania, has preserved the following list of the various articles and their value, which were delivered for one single root of the rare species called the Viceroy. 2 lasts of wheat, 448 florins. 4 lasts of rye, 558 florins. 4 fat oxen, 480 florins. 8 fat swine, 240 florins. 12 fat sheep, 120 florins. 2 hogsheads of wine, 70 florins. 4 tons of beer, 32 florins. 2 tons of butter, 192 florins. 1,000 pounds of cheese, 120 florins. A complete bed, 100 florins. A suit of clothes, 80 florins. A silver drinking cup, 60 florins. Total, 2,500 florins. People who had been absent from Holland and whose chance it was to return when this folly was at its maximum were sometimes led into awkward dilemmas by their ignorance. There is an amusing instance of the kind related in Blainville's Travels. A wealthy merchant, who prided himself not a little on his rare tulips, received upon one occasion a very valuable consignment of merchandise from the Levant. Intelligence of its arrival was brought him by a sailor, who presented himself for that purpose at the counting house, among bales of goods of every description. The merchant, to reward him for his news, beneficently made him a present of a fine red herring for his breakfast. The sailor had, it appears, a great partiality for onions, and seeing a bulb very like an onion lying upon the counter of this liberal trader, and thinking it no doubt very much out of place among the silks and velvets, he slyly seized an opportunity and slipped it into his pocket, as a relish for his herring. He got clear off with his prize and proceeded to the quay to eat his breakfast. Hardly was his back turned when the merchant missed his valuable Semper Augustus, worth 3,000 florins, or about £280 sterling. The whole establishment was instantly in an uproar. Search was everywhere made for the precious fruit, but it was not to be found. Great was the merchant's distress of mind. The search was renewed, but again without success. At last someone thought of the sailor. The unhappy merchant sprang into the street at the bare suggestion. His alarmed household followed him. The sailor, simple soul, had not thought of concealment. He was found quietly sitting on a coil of ropes, masticating the last morsel of his onion. Little did he dream that he had been eating a breakfast whose cost might have regaled a whole ship's crew for a 12-month, or, as the plundered merchant himself expressed it, might have sumptuously feasted the Prince of Orange and the whole court of the stadtholder. Antony caused pearls to be dissolved in wine to drink the health of Cleopatra. Sir Richard Whittington was as foolishly magnificent in an entertainment to King Henry V, and Sir Thomas Gresham drank a diamond, dissolved in wine, to the health of Queen Elizabeth, when she opened the Royal Exchange. But the breakfast of this roguish Dutchman was as splendid as either. He had an advantage, too, over his wasteful predecessors. Their gems did not improve the taste or wholesomeness of their wine, while his tulip was quite delicious with his red herring. The most unfortunate part of the business for him was that he remained in prison for some months on a charge of felony preferred against him by the merchant. Another story is told of an English traveller, which is scarcely less ludicrous. This gentleman, an amateur botanist, happened to see a tulip root lying in the conservatory of a wealthy Dutchman. Being ignorant of its quality, he took out his penknife and peeled off its coats, with the view of making experiments upon it. When it was by this means reduced to half its original size, he cut it into 2 equal sections, making all the time many learned remarks on the single appearances of the unknown bulb. Suddenly the owner pounced upon him, and with a fury in his eyes asked him if he knew what he had been doing. "Peeling a most extraordinary onion," replied the philosopher. "100.000 devils," said the Dutchman. "It is an Admiral van der Eck." "Thank you," replied the traveller, taking out his notebook to make a memorandum of the same. "Are these admirals common in your country?" "Death and the devil," said the Dutchman, seizing the astonished man of science by the collar. "Come before the syndic and you shall see." In spite of his remonstrances, the traveller was led through the streets, followed by a mob of persons. When brought into the presence of the magistrate, he learned, to his consternation, that the root upon which he had been experimentalizing was worth 4,000 florins. And notwithstanding all he could urge in extenuation, he was lodged in prison until he found securities for the payment of this sum. The demand for tulips of a rare species increased so much in the year 1636 that regular marts for their sale were established in the stock exchange of Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, Haarlem, Leyden, Alkmaar, Hoorn, and other towns. Symptoms of gambling now became, for the first time, apparent. The stock jobbers, ever on the alert for a new speculation, dealt largely in tulips, making use of all the means they so well knew how to employ to cause fluctuations in prices. At first, as in all these gambling mania, confidence was at its height and everybody gained. The tulip jobbers speculated in the rise and fall of the tulip stocks and made large profits by buying when prices fell and selling out when they rose. Many individuals grew suddenly rich. A golden bait hung temptingly out before the people, and one after the other they rushed to the tulip marts like flies around a honeypot. Everyone imagined that the passion for tulips would last forever, and that the wealthy from every part of the world would send to Holland and pay whatever prices were asked for them. The riches of Europe would be concentrated on the shores of the Zuyder Zee, and poverty banished from the favored clime of Holland. Nobles, citizens, farmers, mechanics, seamen, footmen, maidservants, even chimney sweeps and old clotheswomen dabbled in tulips. People of all grades converted their property into cash and invested it in flowers. Houses and lands were offered for sale at ruinously low prices, or assigned in payment of bargains made at the tulip mart. Foreigners became smitten with the same frenzy, and money poured into Holland from all directions. The prices of the necessities of life rose again by degrees. Houses and lands, horses and carriages, and luxuries of every sort rose in value with them. And for some months, Holland seemed the very antechamber of Plutus. The operations of the trade became so extensive and so intricate that it was found necessary to draw up a code of laws for the guidance of the dealers. Notaries and clerks were also appointed, who devoted themselves exclusively to the interests of the trade. The designation of public notary was hardly known in some towns, that of tulip notary usurping its place. In the smaller towns where there was no exchange, the principal tavern was usually selected as the showplace, where high and low traded in tulips and confirmed their bargains over sumptuous entertainments. These dinners were sometimes attended by 200 or 300 persons, and large vases of tulips in full bloom were placed at regular intervals upon the tables and sideboards for their gratifications during the repast. At last, however, the more prudent began to see that this folly could not last forever. Rich people no longer bought the flowers to keep them in their gardens, but to sell them again at cent per cent profit. It was seen that somebody must lose fearfully in the end. As this conviction spread, prices fell and never rose again. Confidence was destroyed and a universal panic seized upon the dealers. A had agreed to purchase 10 Semper Augustines from B at 4,000 florins each, at 6 weeks after the signing of the contract. B was ready with the flowers at the appointed time, but the price had fallen to 300 or 400 florins, and A refused either to pay the difference or receive the tulips. Defaulters were announced day after day in all the towns of Holland. Hundreds who, a few months previously, had begun to doubt that there was such a thing as poverty in the land, suddenly found themselves the possessors of a few bulbs which nobody would buy, even though they offered them at a quarter of the sums they had paid for them. The cry of distress resounded everywhere, and each man accused his neighbor. The few who had contrived to enrich themselves hid their wealth from the knowledge of their fellow citizens, and invested it in the English or other funds. Many who, for a brief season, had emerged from humbler walks of life were cast back into their original obscurity. Substantial merchants were reduced almost to beggary, and many a representative of a noble line saw the fortunes of his house ruined beyond redemption. When the first alarm subsided, the tulip holders in the several towns held public meetings to devise what measures were best to be taken to restore public credit. It was generally agreed that deputies should be sent from all parts to Amsterdam to consult with the government upon some remedy for the evil. The government at first refused to interfere, but advised the tulip holders to agree to some plan among themselves. Several meetings were held for this purpose, but no measure could be devised likely to give satisfaction to the deluded people. or repair even a slight portion of the mischief that had been done. The language of complaint and reproach was in everybody's mouth, and all the meetings were of the most stormy character. At last, however, after much bickering and ill will, it was agreed at Amsterdam by the assembled deputies that all contracts made in the height of the Mania, or prior to the month of November 1636, should be declared null and void, and that in those made after the date, purchasers should be freed from their engagements on paying 10% to the vendor. This decision gave no satisfaction. The vendors who had their tulips on hand were, of course, discontented, and those who had pledged themselves to purchase thought themselves hardly treated. Tulips which had at one time been worth 6,000 florins were now to be procured for 500, so that composition of 10% was 100 florins more than the actual value. Actions for breach of contract were threatened in all courts of the country, but the latter refused to take cognizance of gambling transactions. The matter was finally referred to the Provincial Council at The Hague, and it was confidently expected that the wisdom of this body would invent some measure by which credit should be restored. Expectation was on the stretch for its decision, but it never came. The members continued to deliberate week after week, and at last, after thinking about it for 3 months, declared that they could offer no final decision until they had more information. They advised, however, that in the meantime every vendor should, in the presence of witnesses, offer the tulips in natura to the purchaser for the sums agreed upon. If the latter refused to take them, they might be put up for sale by public auction, and the original contractor held responsible for the difference between the actual and the stipulated price. This was exactly the plan recommended by the deputies, and which was already shown to be of no avail. There was no court in Holland which would enforce payment. The question was raised in Amsterdam, but the judges unanimously refused to interfere, on the grounds that debts contracted in gambling were no debts in law. Thus the matter rested. To find a remedy was beyond the power of the government. Those who were unlucky enough to have stores of tulips on hand at the time of the sudden reaction were left to bear their ruin as philosophically as they could. Those who had made profits were allowed to keep them, but the commerce of the country suffered a severe shock, from which it was many years ere it recovered. The example of the Dutch was imitated to some extent in England. In the year 1636 were publicly traded in the Exchange of London, and the jobbers exerted themselves to the utmost to raise them to the fictitious value they had acquired in Amsterdam. In Paris also the jobbers strove to create a tulipomania. In both cities they only partially succeeded. However, the force of example brought the flowers into great favour, and amongst a certain class of people, tulips have ever since been prized more highly than any other flowers of the field. The Dutch are still notorious for their partiality to them, and continue to pay higher prices for them than any other people. As the rich Englishman boasts of his fine racehorses or his old pictures, so does the wealthy Dutchman vaunt him of his tulips. In England, in our day, strange as it may appear, a tulip will produce more money than an oak. If one could be found, rara in tetris, and black as the black swan alluded to by Juvenal, its price would equal that of a dozen acres of standing corn. In Scotland, toward the close of the 17th century, the highest price for tulips, according to the authority of a writer in the supplement to the 3rd edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, was 10 guineas. The value appears to have diminished from that time till the year 1769, when the two most valuable species in England were the Don Quevedo and the Valantier, the former of which was worth 2 guineas and the latter 2 guineas and a half. These prices appear to have been the minimum. In the year 1800, a common price was 15 guineas for a single bulb. In 1835, so foolish were the fanciers, that a bulb of the species called the Miss Fanny Kemble was sold by public auction in London for £75. Still more astonishing was the price of a tulip in possession of a gardener in the King's Road, Chelsea. In its catalogues it was labelled at 200 guineas. Thus a flower, for which beauty and perfume were surpassed by the abundant roses of the garden, a nosegay of which might be purchased for a penny, was priced at a sum which should have provided an industrious labourer and his family with food and clothes and lodging for 6 years. Should chickweed and groundsel ever come into fashion, the wealthy would no doubt vow with each other in adorning their gardens with them, and paying the most extravagant prices for them. In so doing, they would hardly be more foolish than the admirers of tulips. The common prices for these flowers, at the present time, vary from 500 to 15 guineas, according to the rarity of the species. Relics. Aforth are old knick-knackets, rusty and caps and jingling jackets. What had the Lothians thee in tackets, atonement guide, and parridge pats and old sort backets afore the flood. Burns. The love for relics is one which will never be eradicated, as long as feeling and affection are denizens of the heart. It is a love which is most easily excited in the best and kindliest natures, and which few are careless enough to scoff at. Would not treasure the lock of hair that once adorned the brow of the faithful wife, now cold in death, or that hung down the neck of a beloved infant, now sleeping under the sward. Not one. They are home relics, whose sacred worth is intelligible to all, spoils rescued from the devouring grave, which, to the affectionate, are all beyond price. How dear to a forlorn survivor the book over whose pages he has pored with one departed. How much greater its value, if that hand, now cold, had written a thought, an opinion, or a name upon the leaf. Besides those sweet domestic relics, there are others which no one can condemn. Relics sanctified by that admiration of greatness and goodness which is akin to love, such as the copy of Montaigne's Florio, with the name of Shakespeare upon the leaf, written by the poet of all time himself. The chair preserved at Antwerp in which Rubens sat when he painted the immortal Descent from the Cross, or the telescope, preserved in the Museum of Florence, which aided Galileo in his sublime discoveries. Who would not look with veneration upon the undoubted arrow of William Tell, the swords of Wallace or of Hampden, or the Bible whose leaves were turned by some stern old father of the faith? Thus the principle of reliquism is hallowed and enshrined by love. But from this germ of purity, how numerous the progeny of errors and superstitions. Men, in their admiration of the great and of all that appertain to them, have forgotten that goodness is a component part of true greatness, and have made fools of themselves for the jawbone of a saint, the toenail of an apostle, the handkerchief a king blew his nose in, or the rope that hanged a criminal. Desiring to rescue some slight token from the graves of their predecessors, they have confounded the famous and the infamous, the renowned and the notorious. Great saints, great sinners, great philosophers, great quacks, great conquerors, great murderers, great ministers, great thieves. Each and all have had their admirers ready to ransack earth, from the equator to either pole, to find a relic of them. The reliquism of modern times dates its origin from the centuries immediately preceding the Crusades. The first pilgrims to the Holy Land brought back to Europe thousands of apocryphal relics, in the purchase of which they had expended all their store. The greatest favourite was the wood of the true cross, which, like the oil of the widow, never diminished. It is generally asserted in the traditions of the Romish Church that the Empress Helen, the mother of Constantine the Great, first discovered the veritable true cross in her pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The Emperor Theodosius made a present of the greater part of it to St. Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, by whom it was studded with precious stones, and deposited in the principal church of that city. It was carried away by the Huns, by whom it was burnt, after they had extracted the valuable jewels it contained. Fragments purporting to have been cut from it were, in the 11th and 12th centuries, to be found in almost every church in Europe, and would, if collected together in one place, have been almost sufficient to have built a cathedral. Happy was the sinner who could get a sight of one of them. Happier he who possessed one. To obtain from the greatest dangers were cheerfully braved. They were thought to preserve from all evils, and to cure the most inveterate diseases. Annual pilgrimages were made to the shrines that contained them, and considerable revenues collected from the devotees. Next in renown were those precious relics, the tears of the Saviour. By whom and in what manner they were preserved, the pilgrims did not often inquire. The genuineness was vouched by the Christians of the Holy Land, and that was sufficient. Tears of the Virgin Mary and tears of St. Peter were also to be had, carefully enclosed in little caskets, which the pious might wear in their bosoms. After the tears, the next most precious relics were drops of the blood of Jesus and his martyrs. Hair and toenails were also in great repute, and were sold at extravagant prices. Thousands of pilgrims annually visited Palestine in the 11th and 12th centuries to purchase pretended relics for the home market. The majority of them had no other means of subsistence than the profits thus obtained. Many a nail, cut from the filthy foot of some unscrupulous ecclesiastic, was sold at a diamond's price within 6 months after its severance from its parent toe, upon the supposition that it had once belonged to a saint. Peter's toes were uncommonly prolific, for there were nails enough in Europe, at the time of the Counts of Clermont, to have filled a sack, all of which were devoutly believed to have grown on the sacred feet of that great apostle. The pious come from a distance of 100 German miles to feast their eyes upon them. At Port Royal in Paris is kept with great care a thorn, which the priests of that seminary assert to be one of the identical thorns that bound the holy head of the Son of God. How it came there, and by whom it was preserved, has never been explained. This is the famous thorn, celebrated in the long dissensions of the Jansenists and the Molinists, which worked the miraculous cure upon Mademoiselle Perrier. By merely kissing it, she was cured of a disease of the eyes of long standing. What traveller is unacquainted with the Santa Scala, or holy stairs at Rome? They were brought from Jerusalem along with the true cross by the Empress Helen, and were taken from the house which, according to popular tradition, was inhabited by Pontius Pilate. They are said to be the steps which Jesus ascended and descended when brought into the presence of the Roman governor. They are held in the greatest veneration at Rome. It is sacrilegious to walk upon them. The knees of the faithful must alone touch them in ascending or descending, and that only after they have reverentially kissed them. Europe still swarms with these religious relics. There is hardly a Roman Catholic church in Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, or Belgium without one or more of them. Even the poorly endowed churches of the villages boast the possession of miraculous thigh bones of the innumerable saints of the Romish calendar. La Chapelle is proud of the veritable chasse, or thigh bone of Charlemagne, which cures lameness. Hell has a thigh bone of the Virgin Mary. Spain has 7 or 8, all said to be undoubted relics. Brussels at one time preserved, and perhaps does now, the teeth of St. Gudule. The faithful who suffered from the toothache had only to pray, look at them, and be cured. Some of these holy bones have been buried in different parts of the continent. After a certain lapse of time, water is said to ooze from them, which soon forms a spring and cures all the diseases of the faithful. At a church in hell there's a famous thigh bone which cures barrenness in women. Of this bone, which is under the special superintendence of the Virgin, a pleasant story is related by the incredulous. There resided at Ghent a couple who were blessed with the riches of this world, but whose happiness was sore troubled by the want of children. Great was the grief of the lady who was both beautiful and loving, and many her lamentations to her husband. The latter, annoyed by her unceasing sorrow, advised her to make a pilgrimage to the celebrated chasse of the Virgin. She went, was absent a week, and returned with a face all radiant with joy and pleasure. Her lamentations ceased, and in 9 months afterwards she brought forth a son. But oh, the instability of human joys! The babe, so long desired and so greatly beloved, survived but a few months. 2 years passed over the heads of the disconsolate couple, and no second child appeared to cheer their fireside. The 3rd year passed away with the same result, and the lady once more began to weep. "Cheer up, my love," said her husband, "and go to the holy chasse at hell. Perhaps the Virgin will again listen to your prayers." The lady took courage at the thought, wiped away her tears, and proceeded on the morrow towards hell. She was absent only 3 days and returned home sad, weeping and sorrow-stricken. "What is the matter?" said her husband. "Is the Virgin unwilling to listen to your prayers?" "The Virgin is willing enough," said the disconsolate wife, "and will do what she can for me. But I shall never have any more children. The priest, he has gone from hell, and nobody knows where to find him." It is curious to remark the avidity manifested in all ages, and in all countries, to obtain possession of some relic of any persons who have long been much spoken of for their crimes. When William Longbeard, leader of the populace of London in the reign of Richard III, was hanged at Smithfield, the utmost eagerness was shown to obtain a hair from his head, or a shred from his garments. Women came from Essex, Kent, Suffolk, Sussex, and all the surrounding counties to collect the mould at the foot of his gallows. A hair of his beard was believed to preserve from evil spirits, and a piece of his clothes from aches and pains. In more modern days, a similar avidity was shown to obtain a relic of the luckless Masaniello, the fisherman of Naples. After he'd been raised by mob favor to a height of power more despotic than monarch ever wielded, he was shot by the same populace in the streets, as if he had been a mad dog. His headless trunk was dragged through the mire for several hours, and cast at nightfall into the city ditch. On the morrow, the tide of popular feeling turned once more in his favor. His corpse was sought, arrayed in royal robes, and buried magnificently by torchlight in the cathedral. 10,000 armed men and as many mourners attended at the ceremony. The fisherman's dress which he had worn was rent into shreds by the crowd, to be preserved as relics. The door of his hut was pulled off its hinges by a mob of women, and eagerly cut up into small pieces, to be made into images, caskets, and other mementos. The scanty furniture of his poor abode became of more valuable than the endowments of a palace. The ground he had walked upon was considered sacred, and being collected in small phials was sold at its weight in gold, and worn in the bosom as an amulet. Almost as extraordinary was the frenzy manifested by the populace of Paris on the execution of the atrocious Marchioness de Brinvilliers. There were grounds for popular wonder in the case of Masaniello, who was unstained with personal crimes. But the career of Madame de Brinvilliers was of nature to excite no other feelings than disgust and abhorrence. She was convicted of poisoning several persons and sentenced to be burned in the Place de Grève, and to have her ashes scattered to the winds. On the day of her execution, the populace, struck by her gracefulness and beauty, inveighed against the severity of her sentence. Their pity soon increased to admiration, and ere evening she was considered a saint. Her ashes were industriously collected. Even the charred wood, which had aided to consume her, was eagerly purchased by the populace. Her ashes were thought to preserve from witchcraft. And on that slightly macabre note, I think I'm going to leave it there. As always, if you'd like to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales. The podcast is designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.